And just like that, an entire year has passed. We are now rolling on build 17 of Mordhau, and it seems to me a good time to stop for a moment and reflect, to see how far this game, and indeed we, have come since it all began. Let's wind the clock back a year, to a time before men or elves. This is the 29th of April 2019, the day of Mordhau's long anticipated release on the Steam store. The official trailer had aired just over a week before, and expectations were undeniably high, at least among the people who hadn't tried the game yet. As is custom with game releases, the first days were plagued with technical difficulties. These included, but were not limited to, massive ping spikes and latency issues, gold and XP rewards not being distributed properly, and matchmaking problems. Naturally, most of the updates that followed the coming days were deployed to sort these issues out, and overall, the situation was handled pretty well. After all, the game had sold nearly 500,000 copies within the first week, and seen 60,000 concurrent players, definitely a higher load than the devs could have anticipated. On the 6th of May, on the first week recap, they announced that they were working on 1v1 ranked duels and would continue to expand on competitive modes later down the line. Feitora and Castello were at this stage also in the pipeline. Patch 6 on the 15th of May was the first update with more than just fixes. It included some gameplay tweaks and quality of life improvements, such as an increased range of kicks against shields, and they also removed the ability to start and participate in vote kicks for players on the opposing team. It had already seen some abuse in public matches, in no small part due to the skill discrepancy between alpha and release players, and it was good to see it dealt with so quickly by the dev team. Before we go any further, let's hop over to Silenceh, the community manager of Venatus Melee, for a report of what they were up to around that same time.
On May 25th, 2019, we hosted our first ever 5 vs 5 skirmish tournament in Europe. Having over 5 years of experience hosting events in this new and unique genre, we were just waiting for Mordhau to release before doing more. This tournament saw 8 teams split into 2 groups for a group stage before facing off in a single elimination bracket. Things were tense when we saw Power Fuel challenge Virtual Nightmares in the grand finals. VK secured their place as the first ever tournament winners in Mordhau history.
Bit of a riposte duel going on here.
Uh-oh.
Stouty is flesh wounded.
Stouty does it in time.
Stouty gets it while he's flesh wounded. Stouty was already dead.
Patch 7 came out on the 8th of June, and this was the first content update to the game. It brought us Crossroads in its initial form, as well as mortars, javelins, and the infamous heavy hand axe. We saw some balancing changes for Taiga Frontline, where they cut out a hole in the palisade to make room for another entrance. There were a myriad minor weapon changes, and the game celebrated 1 million sold copies on the Steam store. Shortly after that, on June the 18th, came the Twitch Rivals, an event where Twitch streamers, Forsen among others, were invited to compete with each other for money in a number of different modes. Competition was fierce, to be sure, and the event was brought to us by casters who shared a great interest in skirmish siege tactics.
The siege tactics.
The mechanics are very important, as you mentioned, the siege tactics.
And said,
for Team Jiro.
It does look like Jiro.
We don't know what kind of teammates that Gyro might have in the backs, you know.
This was also at a time when Ringmaster was generally regarded as one of the best Mordhau players in the EU. Feels like ages ago, I know, but he is still active and you should definitely check out his stream if you haven't already. Patch 8 came out on the 22nd of June. This was a rather minor update, mainly bug fixes. Most noteworthy was the first official sneak peek of Castello. Feitora was at this time nearing completion as well. And after that, all of summer went by before anything new happened. The devs had been working relentlessly for months and months to get the game released, and were probably burnt out proper at this point. So around the time when everyone was going back to work and school, and fun times were over, on the 30th of August, patch 9 was released. But despite the long wait, there wasn't a whole lot of content in it. We got to try out the initial beta version of ranked duels, and the badges that came with it, which admittedly was quite cool. But aside from that, this was mostly a gameplay and combat tweak patch. They added the second turret to Crossroads, firebombs now dealt much less damage in the initial state, which turned them into more of the environmental hazard they are today, as opposed to the deadly weapons of mass destruction they had been up until that point. We also saw some changes to horses, parry turn cap was significantly reduced to the great relief of many players, dynamic feint lockout distribution based on feint time was added to nerf micro feints and attempt to buff late feint follow-up attacks. All weapon release times were shortened and parry duration was adjusted accordingly. This last bit, however, was reversed 3 days later in patch 10, which aside from this and adding a couple more shield nerfs, changed very little about the game. Finally, on the 10th of September, there was a significant content update. Patch 11 introduced Invasion in its initial form on 3 of the 4 available frontline maps: Taiga, Camp, and Grad with Iron Company offense. In an attempt to paint the picture, all that had been available up until this point were 5 frontline maps, and that's assuming you're counting Crossroads. Neither of these were particularly good, they all offered terrible frame rate, slow-paced gameplay, and a chaotic melee experience. This was the state of the game from the end of April until the beginning of September, which is a decently sized 4-month period. As far as pubs went anyway, there wasn't much reason to play the game at all. That didn't change completely with patch 11 either, but it was a decent first step. Another important addition this patch had to offer was the support for automatic mod download whenever you joined a server with custom maps. There had been custom maps available even before this, but they had to be manually installed, and it's probably safe to say that this is where servers like VK Dualyard and others really started to take off. Lastly, patch 11 improved a wide range of UI elements and reverted some shield nerfs from the previous build. Patch 12 came out on September the 27th, and this was mostly a gameplay and combat tweak patch. Invasion player respawn time was increased massively from 5 to 15 seconds, putting it at the same level as Frontline. Also added ability to chamber attacks with ripostes and removed ragdolling effects from successfully parrying couched weapons. Thank the gods for that. Also removed ability to manually angle stab ripostes, it was now tied to parry angle instead. Same thing went for slash and stab morphs, that were now tied to whatever angle the preceding slash was.
At this point, Vanitas Melee had hosted quite a few events. Throughout the summer we held dual and team tournaments, and in the autumn we held qualifier tournaments for all 3 major regions for our upcoming league. These tournaments saw 16 teams in each region compete for a spot among the top 8 that would move on into the league, which was scheduled to take place in early December.
Patch 13 came out about a month later, on the 28th of October. This introduced a new map Feitora for all existing game modes. We got tons of new castle defense weaponry, implemented at maps both new and old. This included throwable boulders, stone baskets, and oil cauldrons. Ladders were as of this patch also droppable. On top of that, this patch reverted the invasion respawn time change from the previous patch. It was now back to 5 seconds again. Otherwise, this was quite the low point for the game in terms of player count. October as well as November were averaging a mere 3,000 players. This had been steadily declining ever since release, and it was difficult to know if it had stabilized yet or was going to drop even lower. Moving right along to patch 14, this too came out about a month after the previous one, on the 25th of November. Allegedly, it improved CPU performance across the board, looking to reduce frame time variance and increase FPS in general, as the performance issues were well known at this point. The objective layout on Feitora was changed. Nobles were moved to the 3rd stage. The parry and chamber box was made bigger, a lot wider, and offered better protection against low strikes and stabs. They also tried to sort out Wessexes, but reverted that change the day after. Miss recovery was now tied to the size of the weapon, shorter recovery for smaller weapons. Patch 14 was also where Billhook got the movement speed debuff upon successful hit, kicks no longer drained stamina, and plate leg armor now dealt twice as much damage as regular kicks. To top things off, there were a million minor weapon adjustments. Closing in on the end of the year, we received patch 15 on December the 18th. This added some delightful Christmas decorations and introduced the second version of Invasion on Grad, where the free guard was on the attacking side. I suppose we also got an invasion mod for Crossroads, but who really cares about that? They also added fire pit for archers and projectiles in general, We got some cool skins for Maul, Bardiage and Arming Swords, and of course it would be shameful not to mention that bucklers and torch shields were made throwable. Kick was now also slightly faster, stamina drain was increased from 0 to 10, and could be parried. This was another big change, mainly there to buff 1vx. Most noteworthy of all changes this patch was probably the rework of shields, however. The held block mechanic that had been present for all of time, as a remnant of the chivalry days, was now removed. From this point onward, shields were functionally just extensive parries that had to be timed properly in order to work. This made them susceptible to drags and morphs, and more in line with the rest of the game. This also meant that the extra kick range against shields that had been present for some time wasn't necessary anymore, and hence removed. Oh, and they introduced the shield wall mode. Leaving the technical side for a bit, December also brought with it a huge upswing of active players. A whopping 34% increase of average players from the month before, which put it at about 4,000 with a peak of 8,400 concurrent players, and officially ended the autumn depression.
The last event that Venatus Melee had hosted was a 10-week league featuring 8 teams from Europe, North America and Oceania to test a new game mode Invasion. In this 6 vs 6 Invasion League that started on December 7th, 2019, the players competed for a global prize pool of $15,000. Securing the league throughout February, with each weekend being a different region's finals. The winning teams were Krabby Thugs from Oceania, Team North from North America and VK from Europe. The winners not only got some of that prize pool, but they also got the exclusive in-game crowns. Even though we learned that Invasion wasn't really fit for competitive, it still led to some great matches.
Staggered spawn if these two die.
Here we go.
Just everyone run in the circle.
It looks like Big Bud's the only one that missed them.
They can't all run in when there's nobody to help them.
I don't know.
10 seconds. 9.
Is that enough progress? I don't know.
6.
No, it was
5. No, it's not.
Oh my god. GG.
Since the league spanned over such a long period of time, it was actually played over 3 different patches. It took off during build 14, then ran through the December patch, and a week and a half into the new year, on the 10th of January, patch 16 was deployed. This was a contentless update, but it still held some interesting changes. Chambering at low stamina would now cause an immediate weapon drop, which was more in line with how parries had always worked. Jump kicks were also added to the game, which undoubtedly was a very divisive decision. Team hit stop was removed for a limited time as well. This was generally regarded as quite a bad decision as far as I could tell, but it is now back in place of course. Patch 16 also made it possible to riposte out of a shield wall without needing to block first. Successfully parrying couched weapons no longer knocked a weapon out of your hands, and feint lockout as well as parry recovery was increased by 25 milliseconds, with the intent of buffing feint punishing. But it probably just sent us deeper down the hole to the Chamber of Secrets.
Sure you don't want to test it first?
Really quite filthy down here.
On this build we stayed for quite a while, without much intrusion from the developers. The active player base remained steady and strong, and the game boasted over 4,000 average players per month, January through March. It took until the 26th of March for the devs to descend from Olympus and bless us with another update. This was the longest wait yet, a whole 76 days since the previous patch. 1 week longer than the gap between patch 8 and 9 summer last year. But it bore some fruit too. Build 17 included the highly anticipated Castello for Invasion, and Mountain Peak was given a much needed castle extension as well as an invasion mode. This put the number of available invasion scenarios up to 8, from the initial 3 we started with 6 or 7 months ago. The armory saw a bit of an overhaul with a 3-fold point inflation for more varied loadouts. Bandages in every build from now on, I guess? Ranked duos finally left beta phase, reset MMR and introduced leaderboards. Invasion and Frontline were completely separated in matchmaking as well as on the server side. Team play elements saw some love as well this patch. As already mentioned, Team Hit Stop was re-added to the game. Friendly damage no longer stopped health regen, and team hits no longer flinched parries. Beyond that, there were some changes with interesting implications for 1vx. such as riposte hyper armor, which hit stops and forces a 300 millisecond parry lockout when you hit someone in the middle of riposting. Before moving on to the summary, we'll throw it over to Silenceh for a final message about their future plans for Venatus Melee.
In order to develop the competitive scene even further, we are now working on a community-based ranked matchmaking system called Project Melee Slasher. It's a platform where either 3 versus 3 or 5 versus 5 teams can sign up, choose how many matches they want to play each week, and then get assigned matches to play for MMR. You'll be able to see the match schedule and last week's results on our website meleeslasher.com. You can also join future registered tournaments and have your MMR tracked on those as well, with separate leaderboards. It's set to release in the first weekend of May and is looking to do really big things for the competitive Mordhau community. Next on our plate is the 2 charity events for Mordhau's anniversary. First up on May 2nd and 3rd in Europe is a 5 vs 5 Gold Rush tournament. Gold Rush is Stouty's answer to the lack of a competitive game mode within the base game. The weekend after, on the 9th and 10th of May, will be a 5 vs 5 skirmish tournament in North America with no health regen and no projectiles. It will also be the first Venatus tournament that is tracking MMR. All donations for these events will go towards frontline healthcare workers for the coronavirus efforts and to help them give needed supplies. Make sure to join the Mordhau competitive group Discord to sign up for the Project Melee Slasher and to watch our stream at twitch.tv/VenatusMelee.
All links can be found down in the description. In some ways, Build 17 has been quite drawn out in its deployment. It's not unusual for the developers to release a hotfix after a big patch, but this one has gotten 3, the most recent of which came out on the 10th of April, and there is still some confusion as to what's going to happen with the recent changes. And this is where things get a bit complicated, because originally when I started writing the script, I was feeling quite positive about this patch. It felt like they had made some great improvements for the casual scene. Mountain Peak Invasion was looking quite solid, they were getting up the number of available maps to play, they separated Invasion and Frontline matchmaking completely, and in Hotfix 3 they removed 64-player servers in favor of the 48-player versions. And this last bit was actually a really big improvement. For players who are just starting out, it's helpful to not even have the option to go on a chaotic 64-player server. Previously, new players might have jumped straight into one, gone through some chaotic gameplay with terrible system performance, and come away thinking that that's just the nature of the game. They may never have given it enough thought to narrow the exact problem down, and instead decided to drop the game forever. For people who are more accustomed to the genre, who have been enjoying the game for a while and already know where to look for the best experience, removing 64-player servers also has a positive impact. Because it means that whenever you find yourself on a map you don't exactly enjoy, it is so much easier to find a different server with a decent player count and a map loaded that you'd rather play. This change more than doubles the amount of active 48-player servers. Ease of access to decent gameplay and good maps has improved significantly because of this single change. Therefore, it is a bit disappointing to see the devs backtrack and talk about reintroducing the 64-player servers so soon after their removal. I don't think I've ever heard anyone with experience of the competitive slasher genre advocate for 64-player servers, and there is no way that the devs are of the belief that they are a good idea either. But don't take my word for it. With Hotfix 3, in reference to 48-player servers, the devs explicitly said, "We feel this is a better number when it comes to the gameplay experience." Which, 7 days later, was followed by, "We have heard your complaints, blah blah third person ranked whatever, and we are looking into ways to bring back 64-player servers." Which totally sounds like they got cold feet, and now who's to say what will happen? What path they ultimately choose here doesn't necessarily change my conclusive thoughts on patch 17, because overall it has been an improvement in either case. But excessive player counts have been a huge issue for the game, and ideally it would have been dealt with more than a year ago. I also think their hesitation here perfectly highlights a more fundamental tendency at the studio to refrain from doing what's actually best for the game, out of fear for what the masses will think of it. I don't know if you've forgotten this by now, Tritonian, but you actually have full editorial rights over your own game. And for what it's worth, you also probably have the best understanding of how it should be played and what makes it good. You don't have to listen to angry redditors who backlash at your decisions. Just do what needs to be done. You're always going to disappoint someone with the choices you make. That's just the nature of humanity. But at least make sure not to disappoint yourselves. Despite the little rant about the current server mess, casual play has gotten a huge uplift over the year gone by, and that is important to emphasize. We have gone from a mere 4 frontline maps and no invasion to 6 frontline maps and a whopping 8 invasion scenarios. They've also improved UI a lot and separated frontline and invasion servers as of patch 17, so that people who prefer one mode over the other don't have to worry about getting pushed over to something less enjoyable at the end of a match anymore. All things combined, this gives the game a much more polished feel than it's ever had before. For the longest time it has felt a bit too lacking in content to be worth playing, but as of patch 17 I think that has finally changed. It's just gotten good enough to be generally recommendable to a broader audience. As far as the competitive scene is concerned, this has been an extremely sleep-inducing year. Aside from the ease of access to modern maps, no patch has done anything meaningful for the scene as of yet. This was one of my main grievances about the game in Mordhau's Identity Crisis, in no small part because the whole idea with making the game in the first place was to create a competitive fine-tuned slasher. According to the devs, this could however be about to change rather soon. These are not exactly news anymore, as it was posted at the start of the year, but personally I find their approach quite compelling. What's currently being discussed is a rework of Skirmish, in an attempt to reshape incentives in the mode with the help of a central capture point, to try to get rid of the despicable runaway playstyle that has plagued public servers since day one. This would then serve as a basis for a competitive matchmaking mode, designed for teams of 3 to 6 players, much like the 1v1 ranked duels we have today. I also have it on good authority that this mode would be completely rid of projectiles and ranged weapons as well as health regen. They have previously stated that this sort of team-based ranked mode would follow as soon as 1v1 was up and running properly, and as of patch 17 it is officially out of beta. This skirmish overhaul doesn't sound like it would be too much work, and a new ranked mode may very well be on the horizon. This would improve accessibility to competitive play a lot. Skirmish has always been a fine format in theory, but it has been completely reliant on knowing the right people, comparing schedules, and getting everyone together at the right time. It would actually be the first step towards a more generalized competitive scene. It's crazy how it hasn't been implemented already, but at least they haven't forgotten about it. If this competitive skirmish mode becomes reality, and it truly does focus solely on melee combat without other distractions, I will finally rest my ongoing case for redesigning Invasion. Between the horses, engineers, nobles and archers, the melee experience there is still subpar, but if a workable competitive mode is offered on top, then that doesn't matter anymore. Enough segmentation will then have been accomplished, and that chapter can be closed forever. In Jax's post there's also a mention of a small-scale competitive objective mode being planned for the long term. That is of course good to hear, but given their phrasing of it, and the sound of it, and how long it's taken them to work on other stuff we've already seen, this is probably going to take at least another 2 years, maybe longer before we see anything substantial. So don't blow your dick off in excitement just yet. Beyond that, I still think it's generally good advice to play Mordhau in moderation. If you look at the absolute top tier players, they all sound kind of exhausted and done with the game already. That's easy to understand when you think of how bad the game has been for so long, and still is in some areas. But at the same time, we all saw this coming. The game was really unfinished at release. Anyone who had tested the game beforehand knew that. Ultimately, the devs have been overly ambitious and wanted to do too many things. This year they dedicated most of their time to the casual scene. It has been our responsibility to pace ourselves and not overplay the game in the meantime. I truly believe the best days of Mordhau are ahead of us, and it would be a shame to finish the game before we've seen its final form. Rumor has it, the coming year could at least be the start of that, so let's keep an eye out and see what happens. I for one am excited to see what Sueturnian are gonna bring next. So happy first birthday Mordhau, and thanks for watching. Burgers out.